Hi there, this is David Roach, Quantum Economics and Independent Strategy. Hello there, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you're at. Today, I want to return to the fundamentals of quantum economics. Let's think about forecasts. A good strategist is somebody who can tell a good story, who stitches together a load of disruptive variables in what seems to be a flawless network, almost like the patches of a quilt. And a good forecast is, of course, one where it is all internally consistent. But actually, those forecasts are usually only right by luck and a very small part of the time. The difference in quantum economics is that you don't think in terms of producing that flawless patchwork quilt of consistent and consensus variables. You think in terms of looking at the disruptive variables themselves. These disruptive variables are worth thinking about just as variables, consistent with themselves, but not consistent across, say, 8 or 10 of them, and not consistent with the consensus or logical economic forecast, which strategists are almost obliged to make, and good strategists turn into good stories. So I thought of 8 variables I would like to discuss. First is what I call a Kabul message. I think the lessons of shortfallings and incompetence demonstrated by the Biden administration and the withdrawal from Afghanistan is going to stick. We are not talking about whether democracy building wars are a good idea or a bad idea. We're talking about the management of a withdrawal. I think that will stick. Furthermore, because of the nature of the president, I suspect that it will be compounded by demonstrations of similar shortcomings in other areas, like fiscal policy, where the US is looking to spend $3.5 trillion again, having spent 20–30% of GDP already since the start of the pandemic. This is money which is so huge and so out of proportion that actually an intelligent person would not do it, because the fiscal strains will disrupt the economy and financial markets down the road. But Biden will do it. So I think the net result is the flaws we have seen from Kabul will be layered upon like a lasagna cake or a chocolate cake, successive layers of brown or chocolate, one on top of the other by the time we get to the midterm elections, and then beyond that, presidential elections, which will make, first of all, the midterm elections, it's likely that democracies will lose a substantial amount of power. And I don't think the president will be a second-term president. That means that the door is open, at least partially open, to a return of Trump. And I would make 3 observations about the return of Trump. Number 1 is he's going to be much more extreme than any Trump we've already seen. Number 2, we will see Cold Wars and trade wars breaking out all over the place, because that's how he likes to behave. And he now has a long list of countries and peoples on his hit list. And finally, I think it is quite doubtful that the institutions of democracy in the United States would survive this. That, of course, would be terribly bad for the world, but it doesn't mean it won't happen. And it is certainly not a variable that I would ignore. The second is the picture of China, President Xi, the conflict with Taiwan, the almost inevitability of military conflict with Taiwan, as President Xi, who is a man who has always delivered what he said, has said that he will deal with Taiwan militarily if he cannot deal with it democratically by the end of his term in office. Now, term is a term one probably shouldn't use for the president in China because he really doesn't have a term. But it is likely that within the next 10 years we see that war. Fine. I don't think that's telling you really anything totally unexpected. What I think is more unexpected is the fact that President Xi might die. And because of the amount of power that is concentrated in his personal hands, because of the cult of personality, there is no succession. So there would be a power struggle in China between the Democrats who are there, albeit hiding under the table at the moment, and probably Democrats is the wrong word, let's say liberals, economic at least, and in some ways political, but they're still there. That faction would fight it out with the hard left, which probably includes the military. That fight could well open the door to hostilities with Taiwan, because the hard left could appeal to a nationalist sentiment by using a casus belli, an external event, such as summoning nationalists to the flag in order to deal with the Taiwanese problem. The third, I thought it was time to give you a bit of good news, is what I call positive forward loops and climate change. Renewable energy and battery storage is now at such a low point on the cost curve that it is competitive with traditional fossil fuel power production and way more competitive than any nuclear option. So if the markets are allowed to work their magic, the traditional power industry will be disrupted and replaced. The danger is political interference and of course lobbying with big money from traditional power companies and energy companies, which are part and parcel of our open inverted commas, democratic closed inverted commas system. But if they are allowed to work their magic and renewables do replace traditional power, the forward-feeding loops, I will just mention two of them, are things which are set in motion because the prime moving factor of increased renewable energy is allowed to happen. Two of them would be the deindustrialization of agriculture, the end of industrial fishing, because it would become cost effective. And the science is already there to produce our food, not on farms, which produce 17.6% of global greenhouse gas emissions just from the backside of animals alone. We would grow our food, previously fished, previously generated by crop and livestock on farms, in mass laboratories, which would then be economically efficient. Similarly, if you put in enough power, renewable power, capacity, in order to cope with peak demand, that means most times of the day and most times of the year, you have excess power. That excess power can be sold very cheaply because its cost is virtually zero, except for the capital cost of putting in the renewables and batteries themselves. Sold at cheap rates, it will accelerate enormously the impact of electric vehicles, transport, and even air travel. And it will allow all the homes that we need to be heated and to be cooled in summer at virtually zero cost. Now, once you do those things, take agriculture as an example, your greenhouse gases go down by, I don't know, 15, 16%, just from animal husbandry alone. You can rewild the land. You can rewild the ocean. And at that point in time, the rewilded land, the rewilded ocean starts to absorb more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the climate risk, the increase in the temperature of our climate, declines, not just because the initial stage of renewable energy happened, but because agriculture of an industrial sort and fishing of an industrial sort was replaced, but now also because the land has been rewilded, the ocean has been rewilded. So when you think about climate change, which we all do, in sci-fi movie horror stories of collapse and destruction of humanity, which are probably still the most likely sequence of events we will see. We must not forget also that there are positive things that can happen, and they can happen outside the massive bureaucracy of the IPCC and government, lobbying groups, and so on. It can happen through market magic to a very substantial degree. The fourth surprise is the pandemic and underdeveloped countries. It is quite clear that rich democracies are no longer going to fight for a zero COVID policy. It's just for democratically, again, in inverted commas, elected governments, too economically costly to do so. It is better and cheaper, and therefore will ultimately get more votes because people are what they are, to let a certain proportion of people get the disease and a certain proportion die. But what that means is the virus will always be with us. And the underdeveloped countries, which are at the moment receiving a paltry amount of the vaccines that they should, will become the laboratory and testing ground for new species. Some will be less deadly, some will be more deadly. But the idea that viruses have to have passports is likely to stick with us, but is unlikely to be efficacious. The viruses will come to the rich countries on boats and planes, and the rich countries will react by limiting not only globalization of trade, but interchange of all sorts and kinds across the planet. It will increase the inward focus of governments throughout the world, and it will decrease growth because it will remove a highly productive segment of that growth on both the supply and the demand side of developing countries, which will be kept as far as they can at arm's length. Then there are crypto assets. Now, crypto assets, in particular private sector cryptocurrencies, have been under almost nuclear attack by every worthy central banker and government official on the planet. The risks have been laid down, but the ultimate lesson from those attacks is that central banks and governments are afraid. Now, why are they afraid? They're afraid because people prefer private sector crypto assets. Of course, there are many problems with crypto assets. We come to that in a minute. But people prefer it because it gets them out of the way of governments which are invading increasingly their private space, and because they don't trust central banks to revert to a normal monetary policy which will preserve the value of currency. And they are sure that central bank cryptocurrencies will in essence track them. So the anonymity of cash, as we have traditionally known it, will disappear. Therefore, we have to think what will make private sector cryptocurrencies reach a really critical mass. And the answer is the network they generate by doing so. The network is essentially the determinant of value, not only of crypto assets, but of traditional money. Central banks don't back traditional money. They don't have any goal to do so, or not enough, or they don't subscribe to that philosophy. So in order to be credible A cryptocurrency simply has to be of a network, to have a network, which is the same or similar or bigger than a traditional currency. At that point in time, of the crypto, because the amount of participation and the amount of transactions happening every second will impart stability. Secondly, that same stability will make the crypto asset a better store of wealth. So it will be increasingly an investment asset. That is why I'm bullish about crypto assets. I don't expect the problems associated with them to be solved anytime soon, but I suspect they will solve themselves. And I suspect they will be much, much more popular than central bank digital currencies. Then there is war and economics. I'm impressed by the divorce of economic success and military power. Now, of course, China is both economically successful and has military power. But Russia has an economy the size of Italy's. And nobody can say it is not powerful. Nobody can say it does not sit at the top table along with America, because it does, undeservedly, and in many ways indecently, and certainly without any sense of morals or ethics, but it sits there. One of the factors driving this is the fact that war is getting cheaper. Now, there are two ways in which it's getting cheaper. One is that it is possible to wage war without killing your own people. And killing your own people is essentially the sort of television coverage which turns your voting population, or if you don't have a voting population, creates popular discontent, of which dictatorships are even more fearful than democracies. So what you use drones, unmanned ships, unmanned tanks, and you wage your war that way. Now, 10 years ago, that was prohibitively expensive. So was cyber war. Now it's not. Countries like Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, these sort of countries can afford war. Essentially, the cost of the material has collapsed. You can now buy a pretty good 11-hour flying time killer drone from a country like Israel for 11 million US dollars, which frankly is peanuts. So a country which is very small can afford to buy a very big military potency. What that actually does is to put war into the affordable character for all forms of criminal gangs, rogue states, and so on. You don't have to be, though criminal gangs, particularly drug gangs, are in a sense successful in that they've got a lot of money. But essentially what I'm saying is that the military landscape is fragmenting. Of course, it started to fragment with the fall of the wall and the so-called end of history, which seemingly did not end after all. But now the fragmentation of that landscape is accelerating every day. And it will disrupt our world in ways which we cannot anticipate. 9/11 was nothing compared to what we will see in the future. And finally, there is the legacy of disease and disruption. I'm talking about what the post-pandemic world does and looks like, what the architecture of it is. It will be one of big government, nationalist economics, deglobalization, and perhaps most significantly, that what I call marriage made in hell between the central banks and ministries of finance, which are now the back door and the front door of the same building. The Ministry of Finance spends money it does not have and prints bonds to finance the difference. The central bank prints money to buy the bonds and expands the money supply and the liquidity accordingly, and markets rejoice. And this, like all good marriages, is set, at least in their intentions, the policymakers, until death do us apart. It can go wrong for two reasons. Number one, it collapses under its own weight. It is, as a system, illogical and unsustainable. Even my beloved mongrel dog knows that. The second way it can go wrong is that it produces a very low growth, low productivity, high inflation economy. The high inflation suits the government, talk about 8, 10, 12%, because it makes it look like their debt burden is diminishing. And of course, it enables them to run deficits where they can pay fictitious social income to the people who suffer from the immense inequalities which have been furthered and deepened by the pandemic. Thank you for watching. Goodbye, good night, and don't turn off all the lights.